We Americans are divided by political party, religion, and social class to keep us from ever figuring out the real cancer in American culture, the cause of nearly every American war and the mother of today's corruption.
It's the Federal Reserve, okay? 0.5% of the citizens of this country own more assets than the bottom 90%. That's all happened over the last 10 years since 2008. The Federal Reserve, by the way, that's owned not by the American people, a central bank that's owned by 24 prime brokers, being JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley. How does that work? We don't need to audit the Fed. We need to end the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve has usurped its power and the power of the American people and our elected representatives. And no, they do not have the consent of the governed. We will not comply, we will not submit, and it must be ended.
The Federal Reserve banking system introduced the most destructive form of usury the modern world has ever known, a debt-based currency designed to rob and enslave entire nations. The Federal Reserve prints money out of thin air, and this has given the crooks who wield it the power and influence to create their own corporate government within the United States. And the IRS has made every hard-working American into a criminal, guilty until proven innocent. The IRS was always seen as unconstitutional, but in 1913, the powers of the IRS were weaponized and made de facto law by the 16th Amendment, never properly ratified, which states that the government can collect a percentage of everyone's income. Over 50% of Americans refuse this unconstitutional amendment, but the IRS will come after you. They have a long reputation for targeting religious groups and political opponents, and it's only looking to get much worse. The Inflation Reduction Act guarantees more inflation, with the billions of dollars required to be printed out of thin air. And while local police are defunded so that violent criminals are set free, the IRS is being funded to hire over 80,000 new agents to make sure everyone is paying their taxes. And they have recently bought 5 million rounds of ammunition. They are building their own police force to execute search warrants, make arrests, and exert the use of deadly force. While many liberal progressives may argue that the crimes of the Federal Reserve are necessary, they are hurting people worldwide. Because it's the world's reserve currency, 40% of international transactions are in USD. And as the Fed continues pushing the illusion of a strong dollar, the rest of the world is made poor. If the Americans don't remedy the situation soon, then the international community has a reasonable excuse to get involved. The entire international fiat system is collapsing, and the crooks responsible will be selling us a new centralized digital currency, which is obviously another trap. But the alternative is simple: restore the constitutional republic to promote the general welfare and secure the blessings of liberty with sound money backed by gold and silver. End the Fed, the IRS, the CIA, the FBI. It's written right there on your $100 reserve note. Whenever any form of government becomes destructive, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government that will most benefit their safety and happiness.
What is the highest federal income tax any American should have to pay?
Well, we should have the lowest tax that we've ever had, and up until 1913 it was 0%. What's so bad about that? Now, I would like to follow up on that because I think the question on taxes is generally misleading because anytime you spend money, it's a tax. You might tax, you might borrow, you might inflate. The vicious tax is attacking the American people, the retired people today, is the inflation tax. The devaluation of the currency, the standard of living is going down, and you need to address that. And that's why I want to make the inflation tax zero as well.
So your answer is zero.
Zero.
Our hardworking population never seems to catch a break. We play by the rules, do everything right, dedicate ourselves to our jobs, and yet our incomes do not keep pace with the cost of living. Our monthly bills only get higher and higher, and our quality of life is on a steady decline. It almost feels like, despite all of the effort, the American dream is totally out of the reach of most Americans. And the worst part of it is that the vast majority of us will probably have to work until we die. Worsening retirement crisis plaguing the United States means that over half of the population will never be able to hang their work hats up to relax and to enjoy their senior years. And many of those who do retire face the risk of falling into poverty in old age as they run out of funds and Social Security benefits fail to provide an adequate safety net for everyone. On top of that, given that the price of pretty much everything we buy and consume on a daily basis continues to reach one record high after the other, and the fact that 61% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck, it's never been harder for U.S. workers to start saving for retirement. In other words, today's cost of living crisis will be tomorrow's retirement crisis, and all of us are going to be dramatically affected by it. That's what we're going to expose today. Before moving on, please support our work with a thumbs up on this video, and don't forget to subscribe. For years we've been warned that our country was marching toward a retirement crisis of epic proportions, but still nothing has been done to effectively prevent things from getting worse, and conditions have become increasingly more difficult for U.S. workers who have the chance to put a percentage of their incomes aside for the future. The truth is that our retirement system is broken, and at this point everyone agrees that it is heading for a major disaster. Did you know that nearly 40% of all American workers have absolutely nothing saved for retirement? 40%. And did you know that pension funds in the United States are currently underfunded by about $6 trillion? The numbers are absolutely mind-blowing. It's getting crystal clear that our society simply does not have the resources necessary to keep all of the promises that have been made to us. The baby boom generation poses a unique challenge for our society because they represent a huge demographic bubble that has fundamentally altered our culture as they pass through each stage of life. Now they are retiring in extremely large numbers, and many of the baby boomers are completely unprepared for retirement. Of course, most of those coming after them are not preparing for retirement either, and the fear over what will happen to the country when Generation X joins baby boomers at retirement age continues to grow. Even when everything was going well, inflation was non-existent. Interest rates were low, stocks were skyrocketing. We still had a multi-trillion-dollar savings shortfall, but then we faced the worst global health emergency of the century. A conflict between two of the world's largest commodity producers has begun. Inflation hit sky highs all over the planet, and now the largest economies are experiencing the fastest rate hiking cycle since the early 1980s, as well as a threat of a severe recession. All of that resulted in catastrophic losses across financial markets, and many households have been completely wiped out in recent months. According to Boston College's Center for Retirement Research, the market turmoil erased some $3.4 trillion from 401k plans and IRAs in the first half of 2022 alone. And that's just for people who have retirement accounts. Today, 51% of American workers do not have an employer-sponsored retirement plan, and most of those don't save nearly enough. In the old days, many large companies offered pensions, but once 401k plans were introduced, that number dropped significantly. In fact, economists expected 401k plans to revolutionize the way that Americans prepare for retirement, but that simply has not happened. Data released by the National Institute on Retirement Security reveals that over the past 35 years, 401k participants are not contributing regularly, asking for withdrawals, and not repaying their loans. More participants are instead treating their 401ks as a checking account and making very little effort to learn how to manage their investments. Less than half of Americans now participate in retirement plans, and those that do have an average of $14,500 in their retirement accounts, when they will need between 20 and 30 times that amount at least, the organization reported. On top of that, we have a lot of individuals who have nothing saved for retirement. About 40% of the workforce, said Diane Oakley, the executive director of the NIRS, adding that when her organization used census data to assess where households were saving enough to retire, with 8 times their projected income, a very conservative estimate of retirement preparedness, we found that 60% of households weren't on track. David John, the senior policy advisor at the AARP Public Policy Institute, highlighted that soon we'll see a boom in the retirement of people reaching retirement ages with no financial cushion to fall back on. We think it's going to start in about 5 years from now and steadily get worse from that point forward, John said. This means that those 50 and older have got a lot of catching up to do if they want to have a comfortable quality of life during their senior years. A financial research firm found that from the 60% of working Americans who saved nothing for retirement, 26% of ages between 50 and 64 and around 14% of those 65 and older have nothing saved as well. The survey doesn't address how much people in those age groups have saved, but is not expected to be enough for retirement, noted Greg McBride, chief financial analyst of Bankrate.com. I'm very worried, McBride says. I'm worried about every age bracket in their own way, and I'm worried about those 50 and up who haven't started saving or haven't saved enough. I worry about those under age 50 who have a great burden for retirement savings and either aren't saving or simply aren't saving enough. Of course, in today's economic environment, it is quite difficult to find the money to put into your retirement account when you are living paycheck to paycheck. Recent surveys have found that this is the case for almost 2/3 of the population. Higher prices for housing, gas, groceries, and energy make it exceedingly difficult for us to manage our finances. Most of us are barely maintaining our living standards. Cost of living has become incredibly oppressive, and according to Number of the Day survey results, 73% of Americans say that over the past year, their income has been falling behind inflation. Even though surging inflation and volatile markets are bad news for people in or nearing retirement, the outlook is even gloomier for young Americans who are priced out of the housing market, struggling to build wealth and buried under mountains of student loan debt. Living standards are going to decline for a large portion of the population who are in retirement. That's the concern, stressed Richard Johnson, a retirement expert of the Urban Institute. For people who are not in that age group, it's still concerning because it could strain the social safety net. Everyone will feel the impact of this crisis because it affects the American standard of living as a whole. In 2019, Boston College estimated there was a $7.1 trillion retirement savings shortfall among American households, with half of them facing the threat of poverty once they stop working. That number hasn't changed much since then, despite the increase in stock and housing prices over the last 3 years. According to the expert, the people who profited from that were people who weren't at risk in the first place. Research done by the University of Georgia found that in order to maintain a standard of living post-retirement, we need to save at least 11 times our income by age 65. That means saving 15 to 17% of your income across your working life. Needless to say, most of us can't afford to do so. And now, millions of hardworking Americans face the reality of spending their senior years in straitened circumstances, struggling to make ends meet. That's a very worrying possibility, especially considering the U.S. is one of the wealthiest countries in the world. Bloomberg analysts note that until the Great Depression, Americans worked until they died, or simply couldn't work anymore, at which point they'd be dependent on charity or extended family for support. The misery of the 1930s prompted the introduction of Social Security to, as President Franklin Roosevelt said, protect against the hazards and vicissitudes of life. The program aimed to provide a minimum level of financial support with individuals and employers, expected to supplement it as life expectancies increased, leading people to spend more years in retirement. But pension plans almost completely disappeared as companies cut costs and embraced 401ks. The plan works quite well for the top third of workers, not so much for the middle third, and not at all for the lower third. Marnell, the director of Boston Oncology Center for Retirement Research, explained, top third always work for companies with 401k plans. The middle third go in and out of employment with coverage and end up with much smaller balances. And the bottom third are generally not covered by any plan and are entirely dependent on Social Security. Things are likely to deteriorate even further as Generation X meets the baby boom generation at retirement ages in the years ahead. The number of Americans aged 65 and over is expected to be 73 million by 2030, or that's about 20% of the population compared with just 49 million or 15% in 2016, and that's according to the Census Bureau. In 1980, there were 3.9 working-age households for every elderly one. Today, there are only 2.8, and a projected decline to 2.3 by 2040. That means that soon there will not be enough workers paying for Social Security and other social safety net programs to support the retirees who depend on them. Adding to this dire picture is the fact that for the first time since 1973, unemployment among workers over the age of 55 has remained higher than that of mid-career professionals for more than 6 months. Around 30% of workers now plan to postpone retirement and work longer. Others facing poor working conditions may instead choose to retire sooner and with less saved. For many, entering retirement early will mean balancing the rising costs of health care, estimated at nearly $300,000 for an average 65-year-old couple with food, housing, and expenses related to long-term care. Bills never seem to stop piling up even as we get older. Simply put, many older workers who urgently need to contribute additional savings for retirement may never be able to do so. Unfortunately, nothing is being done to mitigate the problem. The idea of a national auto IRA that workers could take from employer to employer has been bandied about for more than 15 years, but the only real action has been at the state level. Even there, most state plans exclude the large and growing numbers of workers in the gig economy. Even if Congress can make piecemeal reform, there's an even bigger concern. Whether Social Security can survive in its current form, if no changes are made, the trust fund reserves are expected to run out by 2035, and Americans will receive only 80% of their expected benefits, Bloomberg reported. The consequences of this worsening crisis are going to be severe for both American families and the national economy, as a large share of households are forced to significantly reduce consumption in retirement and will have to rely heavily on their families and on charities and the government for help to make ends meet instead of having control of their economic lives. Millions of Americans will have to muddle through their final years dependent on others for financial support and seeing their standard of living collapse right before their eyes, while the American dream slowly dies.